Welcome to Audio Branding, the hidden gem of marketing. Sound plays a more important role in human behavior and our decision-making than you may realize. In this podcast, I'll help you understand the art and science of sound so you can better influence others in business and your life. I'm your host, Jodi Krangle. Let's delve a little deeper. Well, welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for being here. I know you are a busy guy and a lot of stuff is coming up, so I really appreciate your making the time.
No, thanks for having me, Jodi.
Yeah, so my first question is if you can tell me a story about an early memory of how sound moved you. I'd love to hear about how you got interested in all this sound stuff, because now you're fully integrated, so what got you started?
I grew up in Long Island, New York, which is the suburbs of the city. And there's two sounds. If you're not in the city, there's still sounds that you get from the city, and that is the train. And at certain times of the day, you'll hear the train. And the other thing is fire trucks. My neighbor was a firefighter, so I have fond memories of hearing fire trucks or sirens going off because I knew that he would be out helping people. So for me, around 11 o'clock at night, and the reason is there was traffic that you would hear and you didn't realize it was always omnipresent. But when everybody would be asleep at night, you could hear the train going through Long Island.
Of course.
Cold Spring Harbor, the train station was down the street from my house. And I always had fond memories of the train just coming through the tracks and hearing it just bustling. And what I remember about it, Jodi, is that noise was always around, but you didn't hear it until the cars and everybody was home having dinner or whatever. Later on, you could hear it distinctly. So it was just something after a while. As a kid, I would just wait. You'd know, 11 o'clock, train's coming through, and you'd hear it go through.
Yeah. It's one of those familiar sounds. Like when you grow up with something like that, you listen for it. You hear it everywhere.
Yeah, it was like you would know that we would know it's 11 o'clock at night. Even though the train was going on every 30 minutes, that's when you'd really hear it distinctly because there was no traffic to crowd out the sound.
Really interesting. Yeah. Interesting about the fire trucks too, because I grew up on Buffalo television. So I would see a lot of the news reports talking about like Tonawanda is burning and Cheektowaga is on fire. I heard a lot of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, this was probably back in the 80s. So yeah. But you get used to certain sounds in your neighborhood. And it's funny because now I live very close to a fire station. And I don't notice them unless they happen really late at night. Like other than that, I don't even register that it's here. Like
I live close to the airport now. So the sound I look for is the planes. They don't fly over my head, but they fly like 5 miles, whatever, east or, parallel to my house. So I always get to see them when I'm outside. And it's very soothing. I just enjoy the sounds of these things. So the sounds are and now we hear the traffic because the expressway is not too far from my house, but they're omnipresent if you pay attention to it.
Yeah, they certainly are. And you had mentioned when we were speaking last time that you grew up with radio and that had a big impression on you as well. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, so drive time radio. So I grew up in New York, and the reason why that's a big deal is the marketplace in New York for drive time radio, sports, whatever you want to call it, AM, FM, is very robust. And people, they don't just listen to radio, they interact with radio. So when I grew up, it was the heyday of the Howard Sterns of the world coming up from, I think he was in D.C., then he came to New York, and K-Rock, and I could tell you like the call letters of most of 103.5 KTU, and they would rebrand and different and disc jockeys were very popular. Like it was really an amazing time to grow up in radio. So radio drive time was a big deal where I grew up, and I remember driving to college and listening to Howard Stern and not wanting to leave my car to hear what he was going to say next. So he was a very good communicator. Keeping you on, listening through the commercials. So I always remember that. But the crazy part is the transition from radio to podcasting was really interesting too. So just living through those different eras of radio being dominant, and then later, actually YouTube video, on-demand video is dominant before podcasting, but it was just interesting to watch that transition.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a relationship between radio and podcasting? Like maybe people aren't listening to radio as much anymore, but they've kind of switched over to podcasting because it's their, replacement?
Yeah,
I don't know.
What I think happened, this is my theory, and I believe it's as accurate as anyone could get. So in the early 2000s, YouTube came out. Podcasting and YouTube, basically, if you want to consider when Steve Jobs put podcasting on the map by giving him a place in the Apple universe, that happened in 2005. And YouTube came out in February 2005, and I think a few months later, podcasting was a thing. But YouTube took off way before on-demand audio took off, and I think there's 3 reasons. One, videos on YouTube would get shared via email, and people were like, hey, check this out. And it was all viral type videos. It wasn't like shows at the time. It was just weird things people were sharing on YouTube as a video sharing platform. But for podcasting, unless I was a really into technology, there was no need to listen to podcasts if I was happy with radio. And I believe what happened was we needed Bluetooth-enabled phones to come out. So that took a while for Apple to create that in the iPhone. And then you also needed a Bluetooth-enabled car. So most people don't switch out their cars every year. They switch them out on average every 8 years. So that 8-year
really
lag
between
the Bluetooth device in the car and the Bluetooth on your phone to match up, it gave YouTube and on-demand video about an 8-year head start from 2005 to 2013. 2013, when people started upgrading, that's when you saw the audio was always growing, but that's when we saw a huge discernible bump and boom. And podcasting was 2013, 2014. That's when like Serial came out, all these big blockbuster podcasts. But the audience wasn't there yet. That's why it became blockbuster in those years, because that's when the audience started looking for stuff on podcasts.
Really interesting. Yeah. And of course, you've seen this progress from pretty much like, when did you start getting involved in podcasting?
So I got involved in YouTube first in 2006. And then audio, I got involved in 2012. I started like paying attention. 2013, the summer of 2013, I really got heavy in podcasting because I saw the opportunity and what it could do for people. And like you said, I love voice. It's a much more nuanced form of communication, but it's so profound because right now, even today, even though I think people should have a video component of some sort, when you look at people's stats, the people that listen to audio are much more engaged in that show than the people that watch the video. And I've worked on some of the biggest YouTube shows, and their core audience on audio only on Spotify brings in as much revenue as hundreds of millions of YouTubers watching. So it's just incredible to watch the virality and the commitment that an audio audience has to their shows.
That is fascinating. Yeah, I always wondered if that was the case. So like I've heard other people say, do you really think that the YouTube audience is completely separate from the audio audience? Or do they have any relationship to one another? I kind of use it for discoverability more than anything else, because it's really hard to get a dedicated bunch of people watching you on YouTube and then also listening.
So the challenge with YouTube is, I always say to people when I'm speaking, this is something I'll say, I'll ask them, what is YouTube's number one commitment? And they might say to serve up content creators and da-da-da. And I'll always share with them, their number one commitment is to sell advertisement. So the challenge with that is when you're watching a video, YouTube allows you to scroll to click on another video. And the reason why they want that is they want you to watch as many ads as possible so they can make as much money as they can. So although it's a great platform for creators in some way, it's not great for committed viewership over long term. Audio, because of the nuance, yes, you might have some ads in the front, you might have some mid-rolls, but you listen to a person's voice and you're not necessarily scrolling for the next audio show. You're committed to that show for that half hour. So I do think, though, as things go on, we'll have a much more video focus. It might be Spotify will have a bigger percentage of the video audience because they're also transitioning into video. But
It's
I just
interesting.
think being omnipresent is important, period.
Yeah, yeah. I've been fascinated to see that difference in Spotify too, getting into the video thing. I don't know. I mean, their audio version, like the podcasting discoverability on there is getting larger all the time. So it's been interesting to see that because as a content creator, and you probably experience this too, I'm sure Katie does. When you're putting stuff out, the advertising component, like if you're actually relying on Spotify for your advertising component, they pay pennies on the dollar. Like it's awful. It's awful. And they're like, completely, I don't know, like muzzle musicians almost. It's ridiculous. The
Well,
type
musicians
of,
make less than podcasters. Yeah, it's even
oh
less money.
yeah,
A lot less,
yeah.
yeah.
It's crazy to me that someone who works for Spotify, who represents Spotify, would say that content is free. Like that blew my mind. I was like, okay, yeah, so that's how you think of the musicians who made your platform. Okay, nice. Nice to know. But that's kind of, that's par for the course these days. Like I think unfortunately that audio gets a lot less respect in a lot of aspects.
I would
than it
agree with
should.
you on that. But everything's transitioning. So
Yep.
like everything's always in a transition. Right now, as you already know, having video as a discoverability platform, I think is very important.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think like recording interviews and thinking about really good short form content that you could grab out of it so people could discover you is very important.
Yeah.
So that's just the nature of, since I've been doing this, I haven't seen a year where there hasn't been massive change, and it's always going to be changing and evolving. But right now it's a great time to be alive as a content creator because there are so many different platforms to get the word out. Obviously, I'm big on owning your RSS feed so you have your own content. YouTube doesn't allow you to do that. So I do think people should be on YouTube, but they should also have their audio on their RSS feed out
Agreed.
and about.
Yeah.
The more places you get discovered, the better, honestly.
Yeah. It's interesting as you say that. I've been sort of running through my mind going, okay, so Apple Podcasts, iHeart, then Spotify, and now Apple is kind of dropping in the lists. They used to be completely dominating the entire audio spectrum, and now they're just not. So I don't know whether that is more Android listeners or just more people being counted because, there's a lot out there.
I don't know. Apple's definitely dropping. I don't care what anyone says. It's dropping
Yeah.
big time. It's been happening for a long time. If you leave the country or North America, everybody's on Android platforms. So Spotify is dominant. Like in Philippines, 96% of people consume Spotify or YouTube. Like those are the two dominant platforms. So YouTube is dominant all over the world not because of podcasts. I want to be very clear, because of these celebrity type creators on YouTube.
Oh, yeah.
So that's where, because of that, people assume that's where you get your podcasts. So they might not even be blind to the whole audio universe. But Spotify is also, as a musical platform, is dominant outside the U.S., across the globe. It's pretty crazy how dominant they are.
It definitely is crazy. And I think Google kind of lost. I mean, I guess Google is
you don't really hear
focusing
Google
on
mention
YouTube.
YouTube. Yeah, they own it. They've siphoned all their equity into YouTube. They have tried adding different platforms, but it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I really liked the platform they had for podcasts. I thought it was actually a really good way to listen to things. But, unfortunately, when you stop supporting it, then it just goes away. And Google has a habit of doing that. So,
yeah, I think YouTube just takes so much of the energy in that company that they couldn't start something small, and wasn't worth their time, I guess.
Yeah, and I can understand how that happens. I mean, lots of companies do that, right? But now you started running. When was the first Podfest that you put on? Was it 2012?
No, we did workshops those years. I'd like to say the first one was 2015.
Oh, okay.
2015. Yeah, it was in Tampa, then 2016 in Tampa.
Mm-hmm.
Then we started recording The Messengers, a podcast documentary, in 2016, and we premiered that in Orlando in 2017.
Okay.
And then ever since then, we've been in Orlando.
Yeah, which I appreciate.
A lot of people do. They love Orlando. And it's interesting. It looks like we'll be close to 3,000 attendees this upcoming year.
Really impressive.
Well, I think it's because we just never gave up. We just kept going.
Yeah.
And just kept growing the audience. So it's been a blessing. And this year we have a big track for editors and an editor pass for people that are professionals in the industry, whether it's voiceover, editor, and we'll niche it down as the future. But right now, that's the overall brand. So people could see the other professionals that attend that they might want to hire.
Sure. That actually makes a lot of sense to me. I've been coming whether you had that track or not. So,
well, we want to have a home for that. We noticed that
Sure.
that group doesn't have necessarily a home in the space, and we want to be that home for them, even though they're, like you said, they're already there, but it's great to identify them.
Yeah, very much so. So what made you decide to put on a podcasting convention? Because, I mean, when did podcast movement start? I'm trying to remember.
I think same year. I'd like to say 2015.
Yeah, so around the same time.
I think it was the same year. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. It's all a blur.
I'm sure it is.
I remember we donated to the crowdfunding because we were so excited. But I started it because we did so many workshops helping people get started, and they started calling me for more help. And at the time, all these tools that we have today were not in existence. So I said, let's all get everybody together once a year and compare notes. And it was the only event I ever put on that people would call me out of the blue asking me how much to sponsor. And I was like, you want to sponsor? They're like, yeah. And I realized there was no other, besides Podcast Movement, there was 2 events in the space. And I was like, okay, this could be a really amazing thing. And I just said to myself, I'm going to allow it to grow as big as it wants to grow. And since then now, we get thousands of people every year at Podfest. It's been amazing. And we just have a core community that really supports it and brings friends. So it's been amazing to watch Podfest become this multinational brand that people recognize anywhere we go.
Yeah. And I mean, I love going myself. I'm actually supporting from my...
Yeah, you got the... I was going to wear that shirt. I got the 10-year from last year.
Yeah. This is the first one that I attended, which was 2020, March of 2020.
That was a great event. It
was right before the pandemic. And
7
I remember...
days.
Yeah.
Or 4 or 5 days.
Yeah. Well, we got home on March 10th, I think, and everything was shut down like 3 days later. It was insane. But I remember going around the convention going, there's this little thing they're talking about called COVID. No one really knows what it is. Maybe we shouldn't be shaking hands. Maybe we should be like rubbing elbows, It's like, so.
I don't know if you remember, we had a color-coded system, but no one really wanted to follow it or anything. Yeah. Everyone was like, it's not a big deal.
It was the weirdest thing. But I mean, no one knew that it was going to become this 3-year pandemic. Like, no one had any idea. So, yeah, it was one of the last carefree conventions in general. Actually,
it was the last one in the world in person like that. And then we went virtual, and as you know, we're able to help connect the world, and that was an amazing experience in itself.
Well, that's the end of this episode. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you heard, why not tell a friend about this podcast? It's available in all the usual locations. Until next time.